when they said that, I got really serious about the business of being a good girl and taking care of my sister. But I think I wrongly assumed that I couldn't go to adults anymore for help. And around that time, I discovered in my grandparents' home, in my parents' home, adult reading material. I was getting deeper and deeper into it and began to understand that I needed to keep it secret, that it wasn't appropriate for my age. Just looking for pornography and just the activities that were entering into my world. I think really by about 11, I had developed a sexual addiction. I needed it to be calm.
And looking at it more through kind of a tainted worldly perspective, it was like, oh, all I want to do is have fun, and I just don't want to process anything anymore, and I don't want the weight of that, and so, which is one of the realities of what perseverance means, is to remain under.
They had never had a girl come to them and say she struggled with masturbation. That was the test thing I threw out there, and they handled it really badly. It had such an effect on me that I was living kind of perpetually depressed, not because of the identity as much as I had just given up the fight.
When I began to make friendships, that's all that mattered to me. I went from this place of kind of starving relationally and not even really knowing it, just kind of being numb, to connecting with people. And all of a sudden there was this voracious desire and appetite to have friendships.
Really lead me to an encounter with Jesus that was undeniable. It started with the understanding I was being forgiven of guilt, the guilt of sin.
Hey friends, thanks so much for joining us for another Love and Truth Network podcast, whether you're joining us through Love and Truth Network or a connection there, or through Transforming Congregations and a connection through the United Methodist Church or the Global Methodist Church. We are so glad that you're here. And it's a fun thing to be able every week or so, when I'm not just doing a monologue, to be able to introduce you to guests, to friends, many people that I've known for a long time, some people that I've become relatively newly aware of. But in this case, Laura Leigh is with us, and she and I have been friends for many years, and really consider her to be a ministry partner with all the amazing work that she's been doing for many years, and just thrilled that she's here with us so that you get a chance to get to know her a little bit. And so, Laura Leigh, thanks for joining us for this podcast. Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, you and I have known each other, goodness, for I don't even know now. It's been a lot of years, and I think we first probably got connected through Desert Stream Ministries and Living Waters, and that has been such a blessing to me. Andrew Comiskey and the amazing work that he and his ministry have been doing for 42 or 43 years is just incredible. And there's been so many connections made around the country, and in some cases around the world, through the ministry of Desert Stream. And we love Andy, love that ministry, love the people on staff there. And but you and I have connected in multiple ways there, and it's just been a fun and blessing, fun relationship and blessing to be connected with you and your husband, Mark, as well. So, but having said all of that, if you have anything you want to share about that down the road is fine in our podcast. But if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit with us about your story, and for those watching or listening to be able to kind of hear a little bit about where God, met you, where you met him, what life was like before, and what life has been like since.
From where I began to where I am now.
Yes.
When I do the look back, I'm about to have my 33rd spiritual birthday. And when I think about where I was,
that's awesome,
on January 27th, 1990, I had completely surrendered to a belief about myself. And it had such an effect on me that I was living kind of perpetually depressed, not because of the identity as much as I had just given up the fight in myself and said, well, whatever I am, whatever my life is supposed to be, this is it, And I didn't really know that I was prone to depression. I didn't really know that I was that kind of person, but I began to understand because it really took over. So my story, my family was a really good family. I'm not even exaggerating or putting a nice coat of paint on it. It was a really good family. My mom and dad really loved each other, and how they got started. My dad was my mom's boss, and he realized within just a few months of hiring her that she was somebody he was interested in. They both used to say with a twinkle in their eyes that he made her life hard under him, not because he wanted to do that, but he was just resisting his interest in her. And he worked her really hard and made her stay late. And but when they finally realized that there was some interest there, he fired her because the company had a really hard policy, and they began to pursue a romance. And they got married, and I came along 9 months and just a few days later. So from the very beginning, they they communicated with me and then my sister when she was born that we were wanted and we were loved. In fact, my sister's baby book said our family is complete. They were pleased with what their life had been, and they were kind of a typical couple of the 60s. He was upwardly mobile. He was a management guy, and but when I was 7 years old, something happened in our family that kind of changed the dynamic for all of us. My mom became ill and was diagnosed a few years later with multiple sclerosis, and I was 7, and so there were a lot of fears that came into our family at that point. That it felt insecure to all of us. Even when in later years when I would talk with my mom, I would say that was such a significant point for me too. And she said, I barely remember my daughters for a couple of years because it was such a consuming fight for her. So when we had that, my family got tighter. My mom and dad kind of got on the battleground of how to fight what was happening with my mom. My grandparents came in and were tight. Our neighbors came in around us and they were tight. Everybody was helping us survive, but the adults around me said something that I guess any adult would say to any kid. It wasn't abusive. It wasn't meant to be harsh, but be a good girl. Don't bother your mom. Take good care of your sister. But maybe it was just because of that, where I was in my age. Maybe it was just, how my mind worked. I had lived kind of, I was a little bit precocious at the time, lived in an adult world. And so when they said that, I got really serious about the business of being a good girl and taking care of my sister. But I think I wrongly assumed that I couldn't go to adults anymore for help. And around that time, I discovered in my grandparents' home, in my parents' home, adult reading material, bathroom readers. They were humorous. They had little cartoons in them. And for me, I'd become an avid reader in that couple of years range. And I was reading this material and began to understand adult humor, adult innuendo. Um, then I found in my parents' and grandparents' home pornography, and I found a strange kind of comfort in that. Even when I was young, I
Mm.
knew that I was finding comfort in it. It helped me be calm, and really just dove into that.
Hmm.
In the years that immediately followed, I became, I guess I had an understanding of where to find that in anybody's home. I knew where to look, and I guess looking back,
Yeah.
I know that I had developed an appetite for it. I wouldn't have ever called it what I would call it now, as a kid. So I just look at dirty books. But I also know that some of that understanding, the things that I understood were beyond my emotional ability to handle it. And so even though I found comfort in the
Hmm.
images, even though there was comfort in um, just finding the reading, and then later um, the introduction of other things that were comforting as well, things like masturbation and um, just the fantasy world was unlocked. What I found during those years is I was getting deeper and deeper into it and began to understand that I needed to keep it secret, that it wasn't appropriate for my age, and that um, I understood. So I began to hide
Mm.
what I was doing. Where in the earlier years I didn't, I was. As I look back and I just look at the progress of just looking for pornography and just the activities that were entering into my world, I think really by about 11, I had developed a sexual addiction. I needed it to be calm. And then when I was 12,
Okay. Yep.
I I met a girl who had interests like mine. She was interested in pornography. She was interested in experimentation. And even though I had begun to be an experimenter in the years before with her, it was really my first introduction into same sex mutual desire. And at that point, I think instead of really being interested in
Hmm.
everything, I began to be more interested in just the one thing. And it really just went on like that. I, I,
And the one
yeah,
thing
with
being
her,
and the one thing
and
being same-sex
and
attraction with her,
novels,
or
her and novels, and so my
okay. Yeah.
imaginary
Yep.
world, and then her, and
Yes.
we developed
Hmm.
an emotional bond. She was really my top preference among my friends, and I did have friends, but she would be the one I would
Hmm.
want to spend time with, and so I was really, yeah, we were the same age. So
And she was about the same age?
it
Okay.
progressed just like
Yeah.
that for a little longer, and um, then another hit came to our family. My dad was diagnosed when I was in 10th grade with
Mm.
late stage cancer, and I lost him in my 11th grade year. And what the effect that had,
Yeah.
coupled with some other things surrounding my life, like I wasn't very flexible when we made changes. I wasn't very easygoing about school changes. I wasn't easygoing about classroom changes. I Things rattled my security pretty easily.
Mm.
So when my dad got sick, I really was looking um, for comfort, and I began to develop uh, a relationship with the church. I began to be really introduced to deeper things of God. I had a loose connection with church, but it was deeper at that point. And I began to explore life with Jesus as part of my answer,
Mm.
possibly not for the same sex desire, but like, why was I so anxious? I just really wanted to know why I felt so troubled all the time, and why I wasn't
Mm.
thriving in most of my life. And um, I would swing back and forth between overachieving and underachieving. I was never really just in the middle. I would either knock it out of the out of the ballpark, or then I would just fail. And it was sort of
Yep.
the pattern and rhythm of my life. But when my dad died, my mom, her handicap was still there. My little sister was a couple of years younger than me. Kind of the lion's share of worry landed on me. Nobody tried to put it on me, but I just sort of took it. And I know that I was not speaking to any adult at all about any of my need until my senior year, when I went to our youth pastor and just said, I don't know what to do with this, but I'm really struggling with my thoughts. We had language for that, but like they had never had a girl come to them and say she struggled with masturbation. That was the test thing I threw out there, and they handled it really badly. They said something to me that kind of influenced me. They said, what the youth pastor said to me, girls don't struggle with that. And I was like, oh, it didn't make me think I was a guy, but from then on, I felt like I was different from all other girls. I don't think I thought that before, but it was pretty influential.
Yep.
And about 2 years later, when I went to my pastor and said that I was suicidal, he handed me a pamphlet and, how to know if you're suicidal, which the answer was yes. But it was just so despairing. It was just a ridiculous amount of despair and people being afraid to engage with that in a helpful way. So I stumbled my way through the end of high school and stumbled my way through most of college. And then really the addiction, the addictive side, the emotional deprivation that I was feeling, the despair that I was feeling really began to take over. And I started struggling with my thoughts in a way that was really scary to me. I just felt like I was being compelled all the time, to do this or that. And all of it just seemed extreme and dangerous. And the things that I thought, the things that I believed did not make sense. They defied my own logic, but I couldn't get a grip on them. I couldn't make them stop. I just felt really tortured. And for me, look, right now, just jumping ahead, it's like these in combination, this question about my identity and my place, this question about the addiction, if there's help, and really even religious guilt. I had religious guilt. And I just couldn't solve my own problem. And so things like, are you doing what you can do to help your depression? Are you getting good rest and eating regular meals? It's like nobody tried to get to what was going on, even though I'd present myself to helpers. So really the idea that I didn't want to be alive anymore was pretty predominant. I was so unsound in my thinking by that point. And I just couldn't solve the problem. And so really in the college years, I made a couple of suicide attempts. But I thought about it all the time. And I was asked fairly recently, were any of your attempts serious? And I think that my attempts were serious. I just was very disorganized in a plan. The same things that were tormenting me that way too. I didn't formulate a plan. So Uh, so I
Yeah.
exited college ahead of graduation, and the uh, a lot of my college performance had been pretty good, but when I would swing into this depression, it was just also erratic, and so I would give my energy to the things I was interested in, and I wouldn't give any
Yes.
energy to the things I wasn't interested in. And when I exited college, I moved home with my family. My mom had remarried after my dad's death. Um, and they housed me for a little while. I tried to get some work, and I guess it was just the point that the Lord decided this is I'm going to claim this woman's life. you know, all of a sudden, everything was set up around me
Mm.
to um, really lead me to an encounter with Jesus that was undeniable. Um, it started with the understanding I was being
Mm.
forgiven of guilt, the guilt of sin. And I was at a women's retreat. They had surrounded the building. Was odd. It was just it's an odd memory for me that we all surrounded this building that we were going to meet in, and we all laid hands on the building and
Mm.
prayed that no demonic spirit would enter into that room. And when
Mm.
I picked up my stuff to walk into the building, I had this experience of something really pulling out of my mind. And that night, I received Christ.
Wow.
Um, I received forgiveness of sin for the first time in my
Mm.
life.
Mm.
And the initial honeymoon was really good. Maybe 6 months I was growing.
Mm.
I had some understanding of how he was touching me, how he loved me.
Yep.
And he was like getting into my heart really well. But I met this girl. Actually, I met two girls, and we formed a friendship, and we fellowshiped together. And I had no idea that I was in danger. It was just I had friends, and I loved and appreciated them,
Mm.
but I had friends.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, wow, they both struggled with homosexual desire. And I ended up moving in with one of them, not knowing
Mm.
that fact. And the very night that I moved in with her was my first encounter as an adult. Um, Even though I'd had many other kinds of interactions with people over the years, it was my first encounter as an adult with by my choice that was same-sex desire, even though I didn't know that about her later. It just felt like it happened.
Mm.
It felt like it was my fault.
Mm-hmm.
And we were together for 3.5 years. It was the only
Mm.
long-term relationship I ever had been in. I'd been in some brief encounters over the years, just happenstance, things that just seemed like they happened. They were part of addiction.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, it felt like commitment. I was trying to stabilize myself. I
Yeah.
clung to her so hard, trying to be at peace, trying to be at rest. And, but the relationship started kind of dissolving into broken relating. We got in a cycle of fighting, and we couldn't see eye to eye on things. And I was becoming increasingly isolated. And I didn't want that because really through college, I had been pretty isolated as well. I didn't know that, I didn't know what to call
Mm-hmm.
this. I wasn't calling it a lesbian affair. It just seemed, I don't know, seemed like emotional. It seemed committed, but it was so stressful to me. Uh, so I made a decision, and it really had nothing to do with God or anything about my faith or it, but I made a decision to move. And when I moved, it put a lot of pressure on our relationship. And the cycle of fighting escalated. It became more vocal, more mean, more manipulative, physical sometimes. And I spent a lot of time being embarrassed. Now, it was just an odd particular thing. I felt embarrassed when we would fight like that. I know now a little bit how my personality works, but I was embarrassed because of my personality. I just felt like I was failing and failing her, failing me. Um, and then and then one night, and it's like I don't want to TMI anybody, but we had been in this cycle of breaking up and making up, and it was during one of those making up portions of the cycle that Jesus decided to encounter me in a new way. And I don't know what anybody else thinks about mystical experiences with Jesus, but I feel like he showed up in my living room and spoke to me with an audible voice. Um, the way it feels in my soul, the way it still feels to my body, is I can still feel the physical feeling of his voice. All I have to do is pause, and I remember. But his words to me, in that moment, in that vulnerable place that I was, "I love you. What are you doing?" And if I were to put a sound effect on it, it would be like taking the needle and putting it on the vinyl record and going, "Eek!" It just shifted everything. And so over the next
Yes.
couple of
Yes.
days, I reached out for help. In that moment, I just said, "I'm done. I am absolutely done with this. Get away with me. I don't know what's going on here, but God talked to me." That's what I said to her. But I felt embarrassed that I thought he was actually in the room. And so I reached out to our church, and a friend of mine was getting ready to testify that weekend at church. His name is Dennis Jernigan. And for people who were kind of early in these journeys, Dennis Jernigan wrote a really significant album for a lot of us called "Break My Heart, Oh God." And but that night he was sharing his testimony, and
Yes.
I did not personally relate to his testimony of coming out of homosexual desire, but I did relate to his testimony about the despair, the futility of it all. And he sang a song that night. The lyric goes something like this: I wish I could take your heart into my heart. I wish I could show you just how good it feels to let go of the things that you know are killing you and cling to the only one who can heal. And then what I heard in that was the Lord saying to me again, "I love you." So I answered the altar call that night, and I didn't know what I was going to do, but I didn't go up to repent of lesbian relating. I went up saying, I'm in a relationship that I can't get out of. And the ladies who were praying with me, I wanted them to pray for me and pray out loud. But we just stood there for a really long time, and the Lord just got close to me. And I found myself saying, "I can't help myself. I need you to help me." And the next morning, I went back to the church service. It was a Saturday night, Sunday morning church service. I sat in the balcony. It felt like nothing had changed. But when the altar call happened, I saw my girlfriend also walk down. And that was intriguing but frightening. I felt like my turning point was going to be really awkward. This felt like it was going to be a weird experience of a turnaround, but I got up out of the balcony and went to the church offices. I found somebody and I said, I need to hide out here for a little while. And then later that day, I reached out and the pastor's family took me in for a week. I said, I need to be unreachable. This is in the old days when people didn't have cell phones with them everywhere. And I just needed to not be in my
Wow.
home.
Right. Right.
And in that week, the Holy Spirit took advantage of some things in my own heart, the beginning of real openness, the beginning of acknowledging my need, the beginning of saying, I can't help myself. I need you to help me, God. And the Holy Spirit began to really unfold. I felt really like I was supposed to write down every sexual sin, every sexual thought that I could remember. I didn't know that he was reminding me. I didn't know he was doing this work, but I began to write it down, and I was filling up pages, and I was devastated. It was like, for the first time I looked at it, I was like, gosh, this wasn't just a couple of things that would happen here and there. It was a persistent thing, and I didn't know that about myself. So the Holy Spirit and I made this inventory, and during that week, I said, well, what am I going to do with this? So I asked the pastor's wife, I said, what am I going to do with this stuff? And she said, I don't know, maybe you should talk to so-and-so about it. And I said, okay. But she said something that was really profound. And it's funny when I think about it, such a simple thing. She said, Laura, she said that the Lord makes promises to people who overcome. He makes promises to them. And she said, if you want to read about it, you can go read the first few chapters of Revelation. And I saw in these verses of Revelation, here's a church that wants to do right, but they're not doing right. Here's a church that kind of walks in the truth, but they don't walk in truth. Here's a church that kind of cares about people, but they don't, and to each one, the Lord said, to him who overcomes, I will. And so at the end of that week, I got together with a trusted other adult who could handle the depth of this confession, or I thought she could. It was pretty funny. And she said, yes, I'll hear you, and we'll do something with it. And Anna began to read through the confession, and I could tell pretty early on, she was like, oh my gosh, how much is there going to be there? How long is this going to take? And, but when we got to the end of it, she just let me talk it all out. And when we got to the end, she said, I feel like we should just start over. And I couldn't believe it. It's like, are you kidding me? Start over this list? And she said, what we're going to ask is we're going to say, we're going to ask Jesus, where was my way of escape? And the Lord just chose to use that. I was always sensitive. I was always aware of myself. And what happened in that next period of time is, in many, many, many situations, I could see a place where I was making a clear choice to not do right by my own conscience, and just to shut off my conscience and pursue what I was pursuing. And what happened for me in that time, it didn't feel miraculous. It didn't feel amazing. It didn't feel powerful. It felt like, I don't know, ridiculous. It felt, my list was ridiculous. It was just so much stuff. But what happened is I began to own my own choices in some of the things that I was doing. And later in the list, places where I knew it was the Lord telling me that I knew better. In other words, I always had a way of escape, but I was shutting down my conscience over the course of my life.
Yeah.
And the Lord met me. It it was not exciting. It wasn't great. But what happened is we turned the corner, and I began to clean my life and clean my thoughts and clean my world of things that were attached to my former manner of life. And some of these things are things that people don't talk about so much anymore. Things like, getting rid of things that were attached to memorabilia that was attached to people, clothing. Yeah.
Right.
I got
Clothing
really
or
crazy about
music
it. I just
or
started
yeah, any
like,
yep.
oh yeah, I remember wearing this when out it would go. Um, even a lot of my Christian music at the time.
Yep.
So that as a Christian and I was participating in it. And
Mhm.
pretty soon I got my little apartment down to a bed and a few items of clothing and nearly no decor because it was just all wrapped up in memories. But I feel like the Lord really honored that
Mhm.
desire in me to be breaking free. And so I never, at that point in my life, I never again went back to homosexual desire. Fast forward just a few years, I had gotten introduced to Desert Stream
Mm.
Ministries in the late 90s. We'd been doing a program called Pursuing Sexual Wholeness in our group in Oklahoma City. I'd begun to serve people. I didn't feel like I
Right.
was as free as I could be. And so I went to a Living Waters training. And it was at a Living Waters training, the Lord met me. Um, you know, how I would talk about it now is just he actually took me to the time and place when my mom got sick and fear entered into my heart. And he chose to minister. It was just a lady stayed with
Mhm.
me in praying while my mind was just thinking through this history. And I began to talk with Jesus
Yeah.
about things. And Jesus told me the absolute truth in my heart. Things that really pulled the fear down. I asked Jesus, is my mom going to be okay? And I remember thinking, of course she's going to be okay. I mean, look at all these years later, we still have her. But Jesus said in that 7-year-old memory, no, she's not going to be okay. And I knew it was true. He didn't lie to me. And then I said to him, am I
Mm.
going to be okay? And my mind knew, hey, I am walking with Jesus. Everything is fine. All things work together for good to them that love God and are called according to his purpose. So I knew that his answer was going to be yes. But Jesus said, no,
Mm.
you're not going to be okay. He was talking to the 7-year-old, but I'm here. And it had this amazing
Mm.
effect of just like uprooting it, just like pulled it out by the roots, this fear
Yeah.
based world that had driven all this addiction, driven all this darkness in me. And that was in 1999.
Mm.
I'd been walking with Jesus 9 years at the point that happened, but he began to heal me of fears. And I began to understand the Living Waters material differently. I began to see how fear had influenced my view of myself, my femininity, my capability. He was delivering me by
Mm.
that I mean he's setting me free from this strong control of fear in my life. And he did, and I've never gone back to any form of sexual addiction since that time. Now in the years since, Jesus is still resolving things in my
Mm.
heart. I've been walking with him for a really long time. He about 7 years ago started addressing that despair that I was talking about a while ago, that propensity to depression. And he has
Right.
taught me to resist that. It is not true. It's not my destiny. It isn't that it isn't that I can't be low, but I can't let that darkness sit with me. He won't let me. It's part of our fight.
Yes.
Um, he he has restored in
Mm-hmm.
19 years ago. I married Mark Stanlake. The fear of opposite sex relating and the fear of commitment, the Lord had been healing. It led to marriage. The Lord's used quite a bit of time to
Mm-hmm.
heal me in my relationship with my mom and also my dad. Even though my dad's been gone a long time, I was a caregiver for my mom, and we had a lot of honest
Mm-hmm.
talking in those years. So um, I'm still on that journey, and so even though we talk about other stuff from here, it's like he's still at work in me. I have never reached an arrival point. I don't know if people do, but I
Right.
haven't. He's still at work on me. So
Yeah. Well, I love that. I mean, and it's so true. I agree with you on the. I don't think none of us, hopefully none of us actually reach a place where we feel that that
mm-mm.
we're finished. That actually I don't think would be a
Yeah,
great thing in this life. That's for sure. There's always the opportunity of becoming. There's always. I love the phrase
yeah,
in Living Waters and in Desert Stream Ministries of the more. There's always more. And depending on how you look at it, I had a friend who turned around and went back to the world, and one of the things that just kind of consumed him, and we had many conversations
mm,
around this, but he hated the idea of process.
yeah,
I'm so sick of processing. I'm so sick of, and certainly that is not all we're called to be sure. I mean,
right,
there is recreation and fun and enjoyment even in the midst of the processing or around the processing. But this idea that when he would think of the idea
right,
of more, for me, it's this more
right,
to become, this greater opportunity that lies out before us, of
right,
this invitation of God to become more and more like Him, to become more and more free, and for Him, and looking at it more through kind of a tainted worldly
mm,
perspective. It was like, oh, all I want to do is have fun, and I just don't want to process anything anymore, and I don't want the weight of that, and so which is one of the realities of what perseverance means, is to remain under. And so I agree with you. And it's interesting, Laura Leigh, when I listen to you share, and I've known a lot about you, but there's some things that you shared in your story that
mm,
I didn't know before. And there's a lot of ways that my story and yours intersect, in terms of, like, when you're sharing about college and about this, you could do really well, and I did the same. But then when I started making friends, which frankly took a long time because I was very, very
yeah,
socially inept and frightened of every little thing, and so when I began to make friendships, that's all that mattered to me. I went from this place of kind of starving relationally and not even really knowing it, just kind of being numb, to connecting with people. And all of a sudden there was this voracious desire and appetite to have friendships. But of course, the way that I always
yeah,
wound up damaging them, because it would very quickly lead to emotional dependency and those kinds of things. But all of my attention went into that. And now, what I was no longer interested in, which were my courses, that kind of went out the window. And depression was a big part of my experience as well. And so, yeah, I wound up quitting college twice, and then getting kicked out finally in the end. And thankfully, I can laugh about that today, but it wasn't funny at the time. That's for
yeah,
darn sure. But anyway, there's a lot of things that you shared that remind me of some of the experiences that I had as well. So, Laura Leigh, thank you so much for just taking the time to share your story with us here in this first part of our podcast, and just some of the other things that we've chatted about
yeah,
here in this first podcast. And there's a lot more to discuss, friends. So if you've tuned into this and you're watching or listening to what we're talking about, make sure that you tune in next week for the second part of the follow-up of my discussion here with Laura Leigh. Thank you so
yeah.
much.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this week's podcast. Please join us next week for part 2 of this interview.